Okay, thanks everybody for coming along to the introduction to equity, diversity and inclusion, equality policy and better outcomes. So one of the reasons that we decided or wanted to redo this workshop with Northamptonshire Rights and Equality Council is because as a grant making organisation, we introduced equality policies to our funding criteria a few years ago. And as part of our role within the sort of ecosystem of the voluntary and community sector, we wanted to encourage organisations to think about equity, diversity, and inclusion in their work. And this session is going to help highlight and bring awareness to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And hopefully, it's going to build your confidence around the subject and look at those first steps that you can take as an organisation. Obviously, different organisations that are joining us in this webinar, and then obviously watching on YouTube, will be at different stages, not only in terms of where they are in terms of equity, diversity, inclusion, but also in terms of what types of organisations they are. So some are going to be small community groups that are very localised to a particular area. Some organisations are going to be much larger, working across the whole of the county, perhaps working with statutory organisations and public health. So that means that everybody's going to have a slightly different approach to equity and diversity and inclusion and what it means to them and the beneficiaries and community that they're working with. As a funder, as Northamptonshire Community Foundation, we're also on our own journey with this, and we know that along the way there's going to be a lot of learning curves, and our aim is to progress, and we can't obviously achieve instant perfection. And what we're hoping is that we're going to make improvements along the way. With equity, diversity and inclusion, there isn't a final destination. You don't reach the mountain peak of perfect EDI. It's about continued growth and understanding as society changes, and obviously we obviously become more understanding and open and accepting as organisations and as a society. So we aren't also, as an organisation, NCF experts in EDI, but we do have some fantastic expertise from Anjona, who's joining us from Northamptonshire Rights and Equality Council today. And obviously Anjona will be delivering part of the presentation later on. So here are some of the definitions for diversity, inclusion and equity. So these are taken from the Association of Charitable Foundations. I won't read them out to you, as you can see that they're on the screen there. But it's important, I would say, to think about equality, diversity and inclusion for your organisation, because some individuals, groups and communities are more likely to face discrimination and harassment and exclusion in society than others. And it can be the case that sometimes community groups can ignore or discriminate against particular disadvantaged groups unintentionally. So without realizing that this is happening, it can be because there might be some barriers in place that you may not realize are there that are excluding people from accessing your services. And this is a good opportunity for us to stop and think about how people can take part and enjoy all the projects and activities that you're delivering as a VCSE organisation. Somebody said once that there aren't people who are hard to reach, there are just people who are easy to ignore. And I think that really sort of helps to sum up why there are sometimes marginalised communities that exist within our society, and how we can then make sure that we are spotlighting the attention on those groups and thinking about how they can fully integrate and be enabled to take part in society fully. So this is going to be helping you think about what you can do to create an environment which is safe and as inclusive as possible for anyone who wants to join and participate in your organisation. Something else to think about, as well as diversity, inclusion, and equity, is about intersectionality as well. So none of us are just one aspect. So, for instance, none of us are just can be defined purely by one characteristic. So, our gender, our race and ethnicity, our nationality, our age. We are fully formed of many different aspects, and so we aren't able to box people into one type of definition. And it's probably best, rather than thinking of people as I said, in a particular box, but thinking about somebody as almost like a Venn diagram. We aren't able to define people just by one aspect, whether that's religion or, as I said, gender. So another way to sort of think about diversity, inclusion, and equity, apart from these excellent definitions that we've got here, is thinking about diversity is where everybody is invited to the party. Equity means that at this party, everybody gets to contribute to the playlist. And inclusion means that everyone has the opportunity to get on the dance floor or yet be a member of the party planning committee. So that's just another sort of analogy to think about it. And as part of this work, you might be wanting to think about all levels of your organisation. So, of course, that's going to include your beneficiaries and your service users, but you will also might want to be thinking about how you can support your volunteers, your staff, your senior management and trustees, as well within EDI and equality. So this is just another sort of visual example of equality and equity. So as you can see in the above section, we've got equality here where everybody has been treated exactly the same and they all have the same bike, but we can see that it doesn't suit everybody the same way. And then underneath we have the pictures of all of the individuals with their own separate bikes that are catered and tailored to their own different needs. And this is another way of thinking about the difference between the terms equality and equity. So the positives of having a policy around equity, diversity, and inclusion, and possibly even developing an action plan within your organisation, is about reducing inequalities, so tackling things like racism, homophobia, ableism, and other social injustices. Diversification of skills and knowledge. So, by having a wide range of people taking part in your organisation, you're going to have that benefit of having lots of different skills and knowledge and lived experiences feeding into your work. You're going to be able to make sure that you have a greater impact because you're going to be able to include a wide range of different people into the work that you're delivering. And also, you're going to have an improved reputation. So, by becoming an organisation that is very committed to improved equity, diversity, inclusion, you're going to be showing that you are an organisation who is committed to ensuring that everybody can access your services, and therefore that's going to have a knock-on effect in terms of how you are seen by other fellow VCSE organisations, your partner organisations, and then of course the people that you are serving as well. So this section now we're going to be talking about how to write your policy and the key things that you're going to be including with that. So again, here are some definitions on discrimination and harassment. So we have the examples that we've got here. So if a person is prevented from taking part in something based on a particular characteristic they have, that is discrimination. And the example we've got for that is if someone who is gay was made to feel unwelcome at your organisation because of their sexual orientation, that would be classed as discrimination. And then harassment is when somebody behaves in a way which makes someone else feel distressed or humiliated or threatened. And the example here is, for instance, someone teasing someone because of their disability or making racist or sexist remarks. That would be classed as harassment. And harassment that's based on disability, race, religion, gender, um, transgender identity, or sexual orientation is considered by the law to be a hate crime and can be reported to the police. I'm sure that later on Anjona is going to give some more information about hate crime, because that's one of the parts of Northamptonshire Rights and Equality Council that they can help support people with, and she'll be able to give some further details on that. So you might want to call your policy an equality policy or an EDI policy, and it's simply a written agreement for your group to know how you're going to avoid discriminating against people, how you're going to avoid harassment, being able to create that safe and inclusive atmosphere for all of your members, your service users, staff, volunteers, trustees. And it's going to help you also manage a situation if any of these things came up into your group where someone feels that they've been treated unfairly or disrespectfully within the organisation. So under the law, you aren't able to discriminate anyone against any of these protected characteristics. So we've got age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex or sexual orientation, and these will come under the Equality Act of 2010. So with these particular characteristics, we recommend that you would include those within your policy. So that could be listing those 9 protected characteristics and or quoting the Equality Act of 2010. But there also might be particular areas that you want to be specific about that are key to your particular organisation. So for example, you might want to also include people who are involved in substance abuse. That you might also want to include that you are aware and mindful of people who don't have a fixed abode, the Gypsy Roma traveller community. There are obviously lots of different aspects that aren't included in this 9 protected character list that's within law. But as I said, there may be some things that you as an organisation might want to consider and mention within your policy around that area in terms of the communities that you're dealing with in particular. So the next section of the policy would be thinking about what your aims are. So what does your group believe in about EDI? What are your aims and policies? So, for example, that could include obviously recognising that your group knows that some people are particularly vulnerable to discrimination, harassment, and your group making a commitment to be inclusive and welcome as possible. And again, there's a short example there about any town association is committed to treating all people equally and with respect, irrespective of their age, disability, gender, and obviously goes on to name all the protected characteristics. So when you're looking at that, you can be obviously more detailed. It's completely obviously up to your organisation in terms of what level you're at, and how you want to obviously shape and this policy for particularly for your organisation. And obviously you might want to be able to also connect to your members, your beneficiaries, to encourage support from participants who particularly feel disadvantaged or are facing barriers. So some ideas that you might want to think about to get you going and thinking about this is, can you improve access to your group for people who have got physical impairments? So that could be, for example, wheelchair users or people who are part of the deaf community or visually impaired. How would you then go about doing that? Can you improve your publicity to make sure that that's accessible? For example, is it easy to read? Is it available for people who don't have access to the internet? Could you make it easier for people who are parents or have caring responsibilities to come to your meetings by looking at changing the times of the day that you hold the meetings? Or, for example, having, if they're caring for children, having a part of the room that is dedicated to be a play corner so that children can come along to those meetings. Can you change how you allocate tasks and roles to make sure that there's a wide range of people who get to have their voices heard? For example, could you encourage more women to take on roles such as chairing meetings? So these are just some examples of what you could think about. There are some things that you could do um, which wouldn't involve making too many changes or causing lots of extra work. There obviously might be some effort involved, but you could decide to prioritize them by what you think is particularly important. So some might involve getting in extra resources, but some might not. So also thinking about, it's an opportunity to think about what you can do in the here and now, and what you can plan to do in the future. So thinking about what's possible right now for your organisation, and then setting aims and goals to achieve later down the line when you have those resources. What is your organisation committed to do? So you can lay this out in a bullet point list or more detailed paragraphs. So again, there's some examples on the slide there of what you could look to write. So creating an environment free of bullying and harassment, encouraging and promoting and celebrating diversity in your activities, and confronting and challenging discrimination wherever it arises. Those are just some examples of what you could look to include within your policy. We'd also recommend that you had within there a code of conduct. So looking at how you would like people to behave and treat other people within your organisation. So thinking about, how do you want people to be treated? What types of behaviour aren't acceptable? If someone feels harassed, thinking about what they should do about it, who should they tell, what will the group do about it? And if someone breaks that code of conduct, what are the consequences of that? What are the next steps that will be gone through to ensure that everyone is in a safe place? And how are you going to make everyone aware of that code of conduct? So, some examples could be, for instance, asking that all of your members act with honesty, fairness, and integrity, treating people with respect and dignity. So, as I've mentioned in the previous slide, obviously you might have put together that code of conduct, and then if that is broken, or if somebody feels that they have been treated unfairly or disrespectfully, how are you then going to deal with any complaints? So you should have within the EDI and equality policy a process about what will happen. So that may link back to a grievance or disciplinary policy that you may or may not have in place, again depending on the size and the stage of your organisation. Or it can just be within the EDI policy itself. So here are some examples of what you might want to put in place. So for example, the management committee will take those complaints of discrimination and harassment seriously, that they'll investigate them thoroughly and provide opportunities for the person making the complaint to speak in a safe environment. If the complaint is against a particular individual, they're also hearing their point of view, and the committee will then decide the action to take based on the principle of ensuring a continued inclusion and safety of any member who experienced discrimination and harassment. And then any decision to terminate someone's membership will be made in line with the rules set out within the Constitution. So that's a sort of quite a clear example of what the steps are, and that means that if there was a, a, a complaint made within your organisation, you know what the steps are to take. And again, you might want to identify a particular person on the management committee, or a couple of people who might, for instance, take on the responsibility of acting as almost like a sort of safe person to approach. Then, of course, adopting the policy. So there's no point having a policy unless it's going to be actively used and as part of your organization. So it needs to be discussed with the meeting of your members and adopted by your organisation. You need to make sure that any new members who join your organisation are aware of the policy and know where to view it, and that you make sure that it's discussed and reviewed regularly. You have to keep it in mind for your day-to-day work when working with individuals and supporting your beneficiaries and beyond. And then if somebody feels discriminated against or harassed, you're able then to refer back to that policy. And then when you come to use your policy, if you find that there's something missing from it, then you can always ensure that that's then reviewed and amended for future.
Okay, well, firstly, thank you, Alex, for that covering an awful lot of ground around the policy. Just in terms of what I'm going to try and deliver, this is what's going to be involved in my presentation. Just to also say that we're really pleased to be working with the Community Foundation on this. We see them as a really key player in making sure that the equity, diversity and inclusion agenda is promoted in a wide range of grassroots organisations within the county. As I said, this is what I'm going to cover within the presentation around who needs to be involved, what can we actually do, how do we know whether we're doing it well, what other things do we need to get right, and a little bit of information about the Northamptonshire Rights and Equality Council 9-point plan. So in true kind of post-COVID fashion, next slide, please. Okay, so who needs to be involved? Well, Alex talked about when developing a policy, there's opportunities for everybody to be involved, and actually there are really good reasons why that's the case. So we're saying, depending on the size of the organisation, you may or may not have staff, and the structure, you may or may not have members, but you will have trustees, you will have volunteers, and you will have service users. And actually there are great opportunities to get things right by making sure that there is a chance for everybody to have their say on the kind of priorities that you might want to put within this. So in terms of trustees, it may be you talking about this within a trustees meeting, or having kind of any other kind of engagement about that. Definitely with staff, you'd want to see kind of opportunities for touching base with what's being achieved and how it's being achieved on a regular basis. It's really important with volunteers, because it's really important that they're on message with what you're trying to deliver. And members of your organisation, if you do have members, will have a stake in making sure what's delivered is correct. And certainly service users will have their own views about improving access, taking down barriers and making people feel welcome. So next slide, please. So we'd always encourage people to be confident about what they're doing. And one of the key ways they can do that is just analyze what they're already doing around equity, diversity and inclusion. There may be things that might just be done because they're common sense, but do actually improve access, take down barriers, improve whatever. It might be giving particular services at different times for different people, depending on their availability. It may be other things that you are already doing, but be proud of what you're doing and see what you can build on. There's also the stage of actually identifying where is the need. Are there any issues that come out of those discussions with trustees, staff, volunteers, members or service users which identify things that actually need to be done? So once you've identified where you need to progress, what we'd say is try and make it specific and measurable. So if it is about improving the access of a particular age group, for instance, to your service, try and make that specific and measurable. So try and make that will increase by, even if it is 10% over the next 6 months, try and quantify that so that you know whether you're making any progress or not. We'd also encourage you to take risks. The best kind of equality steps in relation to equity, diversity, inclusion are when people actually try something new. One of the issues behind most acts of discrimination is that it happens because people have done something they've always done in a particular way. So when you take risks and do things differently without being afraid of getting things wrong, but actually measuring it and seeing whether it does create another opportunity, that's certainly going to inform what you're going to be doing in the future. As I said, the greatest gains are made with creativity. It is about kind of being creative about, how are you going to improve access or remove barriers? And also, don't forget positive action as a strategy. So positive action is specifically where, say you have identified that there are much less women than men accessing your service. It is perfectly legal and within the law to maybe do a women-only taster session in order to redress that balance. And similarly, in terms of recruitment of trustees or staff or volunteers, where there is evidence of poorer representation of a particular protected characteristic, it is perfectly legal to do things like around positive action to encourage more people to apply for a position or apply or come forward to actually use the service or come forward in terms of applying for staff roles, volunteers roles, or trustees positions. Next slide, please. So how do we know if we're doing things well? So I think with most of the people on the call that we have at the moment, you've all got policies. The key progress is going to be made in terms of plans, having a plan to try and go create progress, and having a plan to know what that progress will look like when it's achieved. And also critically, having the right resources to achieve that plan. And that might be financial resources. It might be kind of assigning a trustee to take a leadership position in terms of progress on EDI, or it might be about, I don't know, putting in staff resources for it, or it actually might be about applying for funding for a project that might redress the balance in terms of breaking down barriers, accessing and ensuring access to your services. So critical question is, do you have the right data? So really, we're all required to kind of monitor what we do. We're all required to be accountable, whether it's to a funder or a trustee, we're all required to do that. So it is this thing about, are we recording the right things? And do we have the data to show whether we're making progress or not? And have you got the right systems for seeking feedback? And that might be, it might it might be kind of something like, I don't know, a contact form on your website, but it also very much might be scheduling coffee and chat with service users and just having an opportunity to gain informal feedback from people. And again, if you've got the plan and you've got the actions that you want to do, and they are specific and measurable, is the progress towards that in sight? Are you getting there? And if you're not, are there any other strategies that you can use to actually get there? Next slide, please. So in 2020, in the summer of 2020, we, as an organisation, with had a series of calls with the community and developed a 9-point plan for individuals, groups, organisations, statutory organisations, and within that, I've drawn out a couple of sections of it. So firstly, looking for all people who benefit from white privilege in the county to commit to reflecting on their own attitudes and beliefs in respect of race, ethnicity, racism, and immigration, and how different power relations operate to perpetuate inequality, and how they consciously or unconsciously benefit from historic racism, with a view to taking positive actions themselves, individually and collectively, to oppose racism and inequality. We'd ask also all local employers with over 10 employees to undertake race equality audits for their employment practices and to actively use positive action to address historic and current underrepresentation, or in some cases, overrepresentation in respect of maybe low pay of Black people and ethnic minorities. Next slide, please. And we also, in this, focused on public bodies committing to legal responsibilities to promote race equality, and may potentially contributing funding, maybe through community foundation, for long-term projects that and infrastructure for the Black and ethnic minority communities and other voluntary sector organisations. So I'm just going to, in the chat, put a link to the whole of the 9-point plan if you want to have a look at it. Yeah, just to do that, and that's on our website. Did get quite a lot of focus in the summer of 2020, which is obviously when all of those Black Lives Matters, George Floyd demonstrations happened. There was this massive emotional outpouring of rage against injustice, but actually very little has changed since then. And it would be great to see everybody playing their part in getting the change that we'd like to see. And I just wanted to just quickly focus on, as an organisation, Northamptonshire Rights and Equality Council, our core business relates to supporting victims of discrimination through representation. We do representation through to tribunal, and that's a free service. Giving immigration advice at level 1, again, that's a free service. Supporting victims of people who have been targeted by hate crime and promoting public legal education. In the sense of, if you want additional help for your policy work or your action plan, or you want someone to look at your action plan or your policy work, we're now in a much more stable situation than we were in when we first jointly delivered this webinar previously. And we are in a situation, should you want to have some kind of critical view of a policy or an action plan, if you would like to send them to us, we can see whether we can add value to it or give recommendations to it. And if you like what we say, if you could give us a donation, that would be fine. And that's an offer that is on the table for people. Also, if you have problems in terms of service users coming up to you saying that they've experienced hate, and they probably won't use those words, but when they're talking to you about maybe an incident that they've seen or heard or experienced on the way to your service or somewhere else, and you don't have the resources to report or don't know how to report, please again do get in touch with us and we will enable that report to be made. And should you have someone who's not getting the service you think that they need, who have been targeted by hate, again, please do get in touch with us, do make the referral. And there are other systems in the county that we can use to try and get the best possible outcome to support people who've been targeted or bring perpetrators to justice.
So going on to equality, diversity, inclusion and collecting data. So here are sort of the main points why we think collecting data is really important for voluntary and community sector organisations, but all organisations really. So it's an opportunity to listen and understand the stories and the experiences of the communities that you're trying to serve. It can obviously demonstrate that impact and reach that your organisation has. So having that understanding about who you are reaching and who you are supporting, but also picking up who you're not reaching as well. It can help your organisation learn and improve on your services from reviewing and analysing the data. And it can be used in lots of different ways. So obviously it can be used externally for funders and partners and potential service users, but it can also be used internally by your staff, volunteers, trustees, as well, to review what the information that it's feeding back to you. And essentially it's a way of collecting data is showing that you're willing to, in some ways, pull back the veil and be honest about what your work is doing and what it's achieving and what it's not achieving also. So things to obviously consider when you're collecting data. So obviously questions have to be inclusive and respectful, and you have to think about how the data is going to be used and where it's going to be presented. So thinking about that, why am I collecting this data? What are we going to use it for? Where are we going to present it? So as I mentioned, whether you're going to be reviewing it as your committee or your trustees to look at who you're reaching in terms of service users, whether the data that you're collecting is about your volunteers, whether the data you're collecting is about your staff and or trustees to review, as Joan had mentioned earlier, doing an audit of your organisation and whether that's going to be shared internally or externally. And then thinking about when you're collecting the data, when could you do that within your work? So that could be, for example, if you're inducting new members to your organisation or your project, it could be at the end of that, it could be within evaluation forms or feedback forms. And then, of course, thinking about things like the data and privacy and confidentiality. So how you can keep surveys anonymous, thinking about the risks of re-identification and storing and sharing data. So risks of re-identification could come about, particularly if you've got a smaller organisation where there might be particular characteristics where people might be able to go, oh, that's so and so, and that's their information. So one of the ways you can stop or help prevent that is by separating the data into particular areas rather than looking at a whole survey that has one particular individual's data, but putting it in, for instance, in data in terms of, for example, age, gender identification, religion, for example, keeping it separated so you can't, it's harder then to go back and match things up. So how to collect the data. So explaining why you're collecting the information. So rather than perhaps just having the questions, thinking about how you can introduce why this information is being collected and what the purpose is on the form or at the induction when you're having that conversation. So we've got this example here, so where you're saying, thank you for taking the time to participate in this survey. The purpose of this survey is, so then giving that explanation about what the information is being used for. So please note that participation is voluntary and all answers and comments you provide will remain confidential. So you can't force anyone to participate in the survey. You can't make people do it. It's completely voluntary. And obviously, as much as we would all love everyone to take part in the survey to create that full picture, you're not always going to get that happen in the same way that obviously as the UK, they ask for a census to be completed, but not every single household does. And so therefore, the information that we get from the census or any type of survey is going to be a proportion. It won't be the full thing, but it'll be a proportion of what's being made up. Making up the organisation or in obviously the wider case of the country. So again, you can add in if you've got any questions about participating or need any special accommodations to participate, please contact so-and-so. And then before you begin the survey, please select the answers. Please select answers to the questions below to provide consent. So obviously this is more of a case if you've sent this out via post or via email, rather than perhaps doing something face-to-face where you're asking about, have they read the information above and do they agree to participate in the survey? So another example of an introduction could be, so we strive to create programs and services that represent the full diversity of the blank community. So that could be the Northampton community, it could be the LGBTQ plus community, it could be the Black African community, whatever community that it is that you are serving. We're asking the following questions about, and obviously you can, obviously whichever area that you're focusing on or several areas that you're focusing on, you can include. So gender and gender identity, race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, to ensure that we're meeting this goal. So within that introduction, you're giving that brief information about why you're collecting that information so that you are able to reflect on whether or not you are reaching those goals of being able to represent the full community that you're supporting or hoping to support, and whether or not you're reaching those goals. So now we're looking at sort of different ways of asking questions. So allowing participants to select multiple options which apply to their identity. So open-ended questions allow people to express themselves, and the answers can help obviously inform the future data collection, because there may be new terminology that comes up that better describes or better explains somebody's identity you might want to use in future surveys. So again, we've got an example here where how do you currently describe your gender identity? And there it's not a tick box. People can put what write down whatever they feel, or they also have the option to say, I prefer not to answer. They then also have the options below where you could ask people to give their pronouns. And there's obviously a range of different pronouns that they can select from. And again, there's still the option of prefer not to answer and prefer to self-describe if that list that has been given isn't a full enough list for them to pick from. Then we've got the multi-select list as well with open text. So with this list, it's in alphabetical order. So it hasn't been, there's no, what it tries to do is make sure that there isn't some type of hierarchy within the list, that if it's purely alphabetical, then it, as I said, it doesn't infer that there's some kind of hierarchy behind it. And then again, we've got examples where another race or ethnicity not listed above, or prefer to self-describe, or again, prefer not to answer. So before sending out your survey, obviously thinking about how you could maybe get feedback from other VCSE organisations on surveys. So that could be, for example, getting in contact with Northamptonshire Rights and Equality Council, or it could be if your survey, for instance, is focusing on a particular aspect of the characteristics, it could be thinking about contacting some particular organisations that are focused and have expertise in that area. So an example could be if you've got questions focused on young people, contacting the Lowdown. If you've got questions relating to LGBTQ, gender identity, sexual orientation, you might want to contact an organisation such as Q Space. So just some examples there. And obviously, if you be aware that if you're asking for some in-depth or substantial feedback, that you might want to compensate people for their time. So as Anjona mentioned, there are lots of voluntary and community sector organisations who are out there who are willing to support other organisations and the sector as a whole, but a donation is always really welcomely received to support their time that they are essentially donating back to you to do some review work. Just to also have a look at some other organisations that are out there that you may want to obviously consider contacting. So this is just a small selection. There are, of course, many organisations within Northamptonshire that support particular communities and therefore have some expertise and knowledge to share. And obviously there are some organisations which are, I would say, sort of people-led, so people with lived experience leading those organisations who I'm sure would be happy to share their knowledge and information with you. So those are just some over there. So in terms of wrapping up the recorded element, so this will be the end of this section. So now those who are joining us on the webinar will have a further Q&A. But as I mentioned, if there are any organisations who are looking for further information or support, there are some amazing organisations that exist within our county that have resources to help, but then there are also some national ones as well. And obviously we wish you all the best moving forward on your equality, diversity and inclusion journey. Thanks very much.